The red eyes watching me from the power lines weren't reflecting my headlights. They were glowing on their own. My name is Jake Morrison, and I work IT support for a medical supply company based out of Charleston. Nothing glamorous, just server maintenance and help desk calls. But it pays the bills and keeps me busy enough. The job requires a lot of driving between our satellite offices scattered across West Virginia, which means I've spent more hours on Route 19 than I care to count. Most of the time it's routine. Coffee at 6 a.m., hit the road by 7, troubleshoot whatever's broken, drive home. October 15th, 2019 started like any other Tuesday. I had a service call in Huntington that should have been simple. Replace some network switches, update a few workstations, maybe grab lunch at that diner near the hospital. The weather looked clear when I left Charleston that morning, just the usual autumn chill and some scattered clouds. I packed my standard kit, laptop bag, tool case, spare cables, energy bars, and a thermos of coffee that would be stone cold by noon. The drive to Huntington went smooth enough. Route 64 west of the interchange, then south on Route 64 until it merged with 19. I'd made this trip probably 50 times over the past 2 years, so I could navigate it half asleep. The work at the Huntington office took longer than expected. One of their servers had corrupted boot sectors that needed manual recovery, and their internet connection kept dropping out every 20 minutes. By the time I finished testing everything and got their systems stable, it was already past 6 p.m. and getting dark. I should have stayed overnight in Huntington. The smart move would have been to grab a hotel room and drive back to Charleston in the morning when I was fresh and the roads were clearer. But I had an early meeting scheduled for Wednesday, and my girlfriend Sarah was making dinner plans for that evening. So I loaded up my gear, grabbed a gas station coffee, and pointed my Honda Civic north on Route 19 toward home. The first hour of driving went fine. Traffic was light once I got past the Huntington suburbs, just the usual mix of commuters heading home and long-haul truckers making their evening runs. I had the radio on low. Some classic rock station out of Charleston, playing the same rotation they'd been cycling for the past decade. The coffee was terrible but caffeinated, and I figured I'd be home by 8:30 if traffic stayed light. Around 7:15 p.m., just north of the Fayette County line, my engine started making a noise I'd never heard before. Not a knock or a rattle, more like a high-pitched whining that seemed to come from somewhere near the transmission. I turned down the radio and listened closer, but the sound came and went unpredictably. Sometimes it would whine for 10 or 15 seconds, then go quiet for a minute or two before starting up again. I wasn't too worried at first. The Civic had about 120,000 miles on it, but I kept up with the maintenance and never had any major problems. The whining noise was annoying, but the engine wasn't overheating and all the dashboard lights looked normal. I figured I could nurse it home and take it to my mechanic in the morning. Then, about 10 miles north of Beckley, the whining turned into grinding. The sound was coming from directly underneath me now, somewhere in the transmission or differential. Every time I pressed the accelerator, the grinding got worse. When I let off the gas, it would quiet down but never completely stop. I pulled over at the next exit and checked under the hood, but everything looked normal in the dim light from my phone's flashlight. No obvious leaks, no loose belts, no smoking components. I got back on the highway and tried to baby the car along, keeping my speed down and avoiding any sudden acceleration. For about 5 miles, this strategy seemed to work. The grinding was still there, but it wasn't getting worse. I started thinking I might actually make it home. That's when the transmission gave up completely. I was climbing a long grade about 15 miles south of Charleston when the grinding noise suddenly stopped, and so did forward motion. The engine was still running, but pressing the accelerator just made the RPMs climb without any corresponding increase in speed. I coasted to the shoulder and tried shifting through all the gears, but nothing engaged. Park, reverse, neutral, drive. The transmission was completely dead, so there I was, stuck on the side of Route 19 at 8:45 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October, with no cell service, and about 30 miles from the nearest town of any size. The highway was elevated at that point, running along a ridge with deep valleys dropping away on both sides. No houses visible, no businesses, just dense forests stretching in every direction under a cloudy night sky. I tried calling for a tow truck, but my phone showed no signal bars, not even emergency service availability. I walked about 50 yards in each direction along the shoulder, holding my phone up like some kind of antenna, but couldn't pick up even one bar of coverage. The nearest call box was probably 10 miles back toward Beckley, which might as well have been on the moon. My options were pretty limited. I could lock up the car and start walking back toward civilization, but that would mean hiking along a busy highway in the dark, with no reflective gear and no guarantee I'd find help before midnight. Or I could stay with the vehicle and wait for a state trooper to come along on patrol. Neither option seemed particularly appealing, but staying put felt safer. I got back in the car, turned on the hazard flashers, and settled in to wait. The Honda's battery was in good shape, so the flashers would run for hours without draining it completely. I had half a bottle of water and 2 energy bars in my laptop bag, plus a fleece jacket in the back seat. Not exactly camping gear, but enough to stay comfortable for a few hours. The first hour of waiting wasn't too bad. A few cars and trucks passed by in both directions, their headlights sweeping over my disabled Honda before disappearing around the next curve. None of them stopped, which wasn't surprising. Most people don't pull over for strangers on dark highways these days, and I probably would have done the same thing in their situation. Around 10 p.m., the traffic started thinning out. Instead of a vehicle every few minutes, I was seeing maybe one set of headlights every 10 or 15 minutes. The forest on both sides of the highway was completely dark. No house lights, no cell towers, no signs of human activity anywhere. Just my hazard flashers blinking red against the guardrail and the occasional sweep of headlights from passing traffic. That's when I started noticing the power lines. Route 19 runs parallel to a major electrical transmission corridor through that part of West Virginia. High-voltage lines carried on steel towers that march across the ridges in perfectly straight rows, disappearing into the distance like a connect-the-dots puzzle drawn across the landscape. During the day, you barely notice them. Just part of the infrastructure that keeps the lights on in Charleston and Huntington. But at night, with no other light sources around, those transmission towers become landmarks, each one silhouetted against the sky, with thick cables drooping in gentle curves between the steel frames. When cars passed by, their headlights would briefly illuminate the nearest towers before moving on, leaving everything dark again. I was sitting in the driver's seat, checking my phone for the 20th time and hoping for a miracle signal bar, when I noticed something moving on the power lines. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A car had just passed heading north, and as its headlights swept across the transmission corridor, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a large bird perched on one of the cross beams. Not unusual. Hawks and eagles use power lines as hunting perches all the time, but this bird seemed bigger than any hawk I'd ever seen. I rolled down my window and listened for a moment, but couldn't hear anything over the ambient highway noise. No wing beats, no calls, no rustling. Whatever was up there was sitting perfectly still. I was about to dismiss it as my imagination when the next car came by, and its headlights confirmed what I'd seen. There was definitely something large perched on the transmission tower about 200 yards up the ridge, something much bigger than any normal bird. It was positioned on the highest crossbeam, maybe 60 feet off the ground, with what looked like wings folded against its body. The headlights only illuminated it for a few seconds before the car moved on, but that was enough to see the basic outline. I tried to convince myself it was just a turkey vulture, or maybe a small eagle that looked bigger than it really was due to the distance and lighting conditions. Birds of prey do hunt at night sometimes, and the transmission lines would give them a good vantage point over the valleys. Perfectly logical explanation, but vultures don't have glowing red eyes. The first time I saw the eye glow, I thought it was a reflection. Another car was approaching from the south, and as its headlights swept across the ridge, 2 small red dots appeared near where the bird was perched, like the retro-reflective tape on road signs or the tapetum in a cat's eyes. Just photons bouncing back toward the light source, except the car had already passed by. The headlights were disappearing around the next curve, fading to black, and those red dots were still glowing. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, staring up at the transmission tower. The red glow was faint but definitely visible against the dark sky. 2 points of light about the right distance apart to be eyes, positioned exactly where I'd seen the large bird-like shape. They weren't flashing or moving, just a steady red glow like the standby light on electronic equipment. My rational mind was working overtime trying to explain what I was seeing. Maybe the creature was wearing some kind of radio collar or tracking device with LED indicators. Wildlife biologists do that sometimes with endangered species. Or maybe it was an optical illusion caused by atmospheric conditions, some kind of light refraction that made distant objects appear to glow. But deep down, I knew I was looking at something that didn't belong in any field guide. I reached for my phone to try taking a picture, but the moment I moved, the red glow disappeared. Not gradually, like eyes closing or a light being turned off, just gone between 1 second and the next. I held my phone up and activated the camera function, but the screen showed nothing but black shapes against a dark sky. The transmission tower was still there, but whatever had been perched on it was gone. For about 10 minutes, nothing happened. I kept the phone camera ready and watched the power lines, but saw no movement and no red glow. A few more cars passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the transmission corridor, but the towers appeared empty. I started to relax a little and think maybe the whole thing had been my imagination amplified by stress and caffeine. Then I heard the sound. It wasn't a bird call or an animal vocalization, at least not like any I'd heard before. More like a low-frequency hum with harmonic overtones, almost like the sound power lines make in humid weather, but deeper and more rhythmic. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating through the car's frame and making my teeth ache. I rolled down both front windows and listened more carefully. The humming continued for maybe 20 seconds, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat and the distant rumble of a truck engine somewhere to the north. But no more humming. That's when I realized the thing wasn't on the power lines anymore. It was standing on the road. About 50 yards ahead of my disabled Honda, something large was silhouetted against the yellow centerline stripe. Bipedal, but not human. Too tall, too broad across the shoulders, with what looked like wings folded against its back. It was facing away from me, looking north up the highway as if watching for approaching traffic. I fumbled for my phone again, but my hands were shaking too badly to operate the camera function. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this couldn't be real, that I was having some kind of breakdown or hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But my eyes were telling me otherwise. The thing on the road wasn't moving, just standing there like a statue, perfectly motionless in the middle of the northbound lane. No breathing motion, no shifting weight, no adjustment of position. It might as well have been carved from stone. A set of headlights appeared around the curve ahead, coming south toward my position. A pickup truck moving at highway speed. I wanted to flash my high beams or honk my horn to warn the driver, but I was paralyzed by the certainty that drawing attention to myself would be a very bad idea. The truck's headlights swept across the road ahead, fully illuminating the stretch of asphalt where the thing was standing. There was nothing there. The pickup passed by without slowing down, its driver completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. But I'd been watching that exact spot, and I was absolutely certain I'd seen something standing in the road just moments before. It hadn't walked away or flown away. It had simply vanished between the time the headlights appeared and when they actually reached that section of highway. I sat in the car for another hour, watching and listening. No more red glows on the power lines, no more humming sounds, no more shapes in the road. Just the normal night sounds of the West Virginia countryside and the occasional vehicle passing by. By midnight, I was starting to think the whole experience had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. That's when the state trooper showed up. I saw his headlights and light bar coming from the south and felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. Finally, someone with a radio who could call for a tow truck and get me out of this situation. I got out of the Honda and walked toward the shoulder, waving my arms to make sure he saw me. The trooper pulled up behind my car and activated his emergency flashers. He was a middle-aged guy with graying hair and the kind of calm, professional demeanor that comes from 20 years of dealing with highway emergencies. His name tag read, Officer Williams. "Vehicle trouble?" he asked, walking around my Honda and checking the damage. "Transmission went out about 3 hours ago," I told him. "No cell service up here, so I've been waiting for someone to come along." Officer Williams nodded and pulled out his radio. "I'll call for a tow truck from Beckley. Should be here in about 45 minutes. He looked at me more carefully. "You okay? You look a little shaken up." I hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell him about what I'd seen. Cops deal with all kinds of weird situations, and maybe he'd encountered something similar before. I described the red eyes on the power lines, the humming sound, and the figure standing in the road. Officer Williams listened without interrupting, but I could see the skepticism in his expression. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Morrison," he said finally, "this stretch of Route 19 gets a lot of unusual reports, especially at night, especially when people are alone and stressed out. The mind can play tricks on you under those conditions. So you think I imagined it? I think you saw something that your brain interpreted as threatening because you were in a vulnerable situation. Could have been a deer, a bear, even just shadows and reflections." He gestured toward the transmission lines. "Those power lines create electromagnetic fields that can affect some people, cause headaches, disorientation, even mild hallucinations." It was a reasonable explanation, and I wanted to believe it. But I knew what I'd seen. The tow truck arrived right on schedule, and Officer Williams stayed until my Honda was loaded up and ready for transport back to Charleston. As I was getting into the tow truck's cab, he handed me his card. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to do me a favor. When you get home tonight, write down everything you remember about what happened here. Date, time, weather conditions, exactly what you saw and heard. Then put it somewhere safe, and don't think about it for a week or two. Why? Because if you start having dreams or flashbacks, or if you find yourself avoiding this stretch of highway, that's your brain trying to process a traumatic experience. And if that happens, you should talk to someone about it." The ride back to Charleston took about an hour. The tow truck driver was a friendly guy who'd been working that route for 15 years, and he had plenty of stories about weird encounters on the back roads of West Virginia. Most of them involved drunk drivers or domestic disputes, but a few were harder to categorize. "You're not the first person to report strange lights around those power lines," he told me as we crossed the Canal River. "State police get maybe 4 or 5 calls a year about UFOs or mysterious aircraft in that area. Never amounts to anything, but people keep seeing things. What do you think it is? Honestly, I think those transmission lines put out enough electromagnetic radiation to interfere with car electronics sometimes. People lose radio reception. Their GPS gets confused. Maybe their engine starts running rough. Then they're sitting there in the dark, feeling anxious and looking for explanations." It made sense from a scientific perspective. High-voltage transmission lines do generate electromagnetic fields that can interfere with sensitive electronics. And if you're already stressed about being stranded on a dark highway, your brain might interpret random stimuli as threatening, but that didn't explain the red eyes, or the figure in the road, or the way the thing had vanished just before the pickup truck's headlights reached it. I got home around 3 a.m. and did exactly what Officer Williams had suggested. Wrote down everything I could remember about the encounter, including details I hadn't mentioned to him. The exact height and wingspan of the thing on the power lines, the harmonic quality of the humming sound, the way the figure in the road had stood perfectly motionless, as if it wasn't breathing. Then I sealed the written account in an envelope and put it in my desk drawer. 2 weeks later, I had to drive back to Huntington for another service call. I took the same route, Route 64 to the interchange, then south on 19. When I reached the spot where my transmission had failed, I slowed down and looked up at the power lines. They were empty. Just steel towers and cables against a clear blue sky. No birds, no mysterious shapes, no red glows. Everything looked perfectly normal in the daylight, but as I drove past that section of highway, I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. There was a new sign posted on the guardrail, the kind the Department of Transportation uses for traffic advisories and road conditions. It read, "Wildlife crossing, next 5 miles. Use caution at night." I'd driven that route dozens of times over the past 2 years, and I'd never seen that sign before. It hadn't been there the night my car broke down, and it wasn't on any of the DOT traffic maps I'd checked online. When I got to Huntington, I called the state DOT office and asked about the new wildlife crossing sign on Route 19. The clerk I spoke to checked their database and told me no new signs had been installed on that stretch of highway in the past 6 months, but the sign was definitely there. I drove past it again on my way home that evening and took a picture with my phone to prove I wasn't imagining things. That night, I called Officer Williams and told him about the sign. He was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Morrison," he said finally, "that sign has been there for about 3 years, right where you say it is. We requested it after a series of incidents in that area." "What kind of incidents?" "The kind that are hard to put in official reports." He wouldn't elaborate, but he did give me one piece of advice that I've followed religiously ever since. If you're ever driving through that area at night and your car breaks down again, don't get out of the vehicle. Don't roll down your windows. Turn on your hazard flashers and call for help on your cell phone. If you can't get a signal, just wait until morning. Someone will find you. I asked him why, but he'd already hung up. I still drive Route 19 when work requires it, but I always make sure to fuel up beforehand and check my transmission fluid, and I never drive that stretch alone after dark. Call it superstition, call it trauma response, call it whatever you want, but some things are better left undisturbed. If you ever find yourself broken down on a dark highway near power lines, and you see red eyes watching you from above, don't try to take pictures. Don't get out of your car. And whatever you do, don't follow anything that tries to lead you away from the road. Some boundaries exist for good reasons, and crossing them might be the last mistake you ever make. The stories you hear about West Virginia aren't just folklore. Some of them are warnings. If you've had your own encounters with things that shouldn't exist, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps make sense of them, or at least helps you realize you're not alone. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more true accounts from the back roads and forgotten places where the ordinary world breaks down. Until next time, stay safe out there. The thing perched on the bridge support wasn't there for the view. It was waiting for something to happen. My name is Ryan Kellerman, and I work as a structural engineer for the West Virginia Department of Highways. Most of my job involves inspecting bridges and overpasses throughout the southern part of the state, documenting wear patterns, checking for stress fractures, and recommending maintenance schedules. It's methodical work that requires attention to detail and a healthy respect for the physics of concrete and steel under load. In early November of 2018, I was assigned to conduct a routine inspection of the Silver Memorial Bridge connecting Point Pleasant, West Virginia to Gallipolis, Ohio. The bridge had been built in 1969 to replace the original Silver Bridge, which collapsed during rush hour traffic in 1967, killing 46 people. The new bridge was designed with multiple redundant safety systems and gets inspected more frequently than most structures of its type. I'd been putting off this particular inspection for about 2 weeks because of scheduling conflicts and bad weather. The work required climbing up into the bridge supports with specialized equipment, and you can't do that safely when it's raining or when wind speeds exceed 20 miles per hour. But November 8th looked perfect. Clear skies, light winds, and temperatures in the low 50s. Ideal conditions for spending a day crawling around steel beams 60 feet above the Ohio River. I loaded up my truck with the standard inspection kit, ultrasonic thickness gauge, digital camera, measuring tools, safety harness, hard hat, and clipboard with data sheets. The drive from Charleston to Point Pleasant takes about an hour and a half on a good day, mostly on Route 35 through rolling hills and small farming communities. I left early enough to arrive by 8 a.m., giving myself plenty of time to set up and complete the inspection before afternoon traffic picked up. Point Pleasant is a quiet river town with about 4,000 residents, best known for the Mothman legend and the annual festival that draws tourists from all over the Midwest. Most locals treat the Mothman stories as harmless folklore, good for business and fun to talk about, but not something anyone takes seriously. The official town motto is Home of the Mothman, and there are statues and murals scattered around downtown depicting a winged humanoid with glowing red eyes. I'd heard all the stories, of course. Every bridge inspector in West Virginia knows about the supposed Mothman sightings that occurred in the months leading up to the original Silver Bridge collapse. According to local legend, dozens of people reported seeing a large winged creature with red eyes in the Point Pleasant area between November 1966 and December 1967. The sightings stopped abruptly after the bridge fell, leading some people to believe the creature was somehow connected to the disaster. Pure folklore, obviously. Bridge collapses happen because of metal fatigue, design flaws, or inadequate maintenance. Not because of supernatural creatures, but the timing of the sightings and the bridge failure had created a local mythology that persisted more than 50 years later. I parked my truck in the small lot next to the Mothman statue and walked out onto the bridge approach to survey the inspection area. The Silver Memorial Bridge is a suspension design with 2 main towers rising about 200 feet above the river. The roadway is suspended from steel cables that run over the tops of the towers and anchor into massive concrete blocks on both sides of the river. Clean lines, elegant engineering, built to last for 100 years. The inspection work began on the Ohio side, where I needed to check the tension measurements on the main support cables and document any signs of corrosion or wear. This required climbing up inside the tower structure using a series of maintenance ladders and platforms built into the framework. Not fun if you're afraid of heights, but I'd been doing this kind of work for 8 years and was comfortable with the safety procedures. The first 2 hours went smoothly. All the cable tensions were within acceptable parameters, and I didn't find any significant corrosion or structural damage. The bridge was in excellent condition. Exactly what you'd expect from a structure that was less than 50 years old and maintained according to DOT standards. I documented everything with photographs and measurements, then moved to the West Virginia Tower to repeat the process. Around 10:30 a.m., while I was about halfway up the West Virginia Tower, I noticed something unusual on the opposite side of the river. There appeared to be a large bird perched on top of the Ohio Tower, much larger than the seagulls and crows that normally hang around the bridge area. It was positioned right at the apex of the tower, about 200 feet above the water, with what looked like substantial wings folded against its body. I pulled out my binoculars and focused on the distant figure, definitely bird-like in profile, but bigger than any species I was familiar with. The wingspan had to be at least 8 feet, possibly 10. The body was dark-colored, charcoal, gray, or black, and it appeared to be facing north toward the town of Point Pleasant. Completely motionless, like a statue. My first thought was that it might be a turkey vulture, which can have impressive wingspans when fully grown. But vultures don't typically perch on high structures during the middle of the day, and they're not usually that large. This thing looked more like a small airplane than any kind of natural bird. I continued with my inspection work, checking cable connections and measuring stress points, but I kept glancing over at the Ohio Tower every few minutes. The bird, creature, whatever it was, remained in exactly the same position for over an hour. No movement, no adjustment of posture, no preening or feeding behavior. Just sitting there like a gargoyle. Around noon, I climbed back down to the bridge deck to eat lunch and review my notes. Traffic was light, a few cars and pickup trucks crossing back and forth between Ohio and West Virginia, but nothing like the rush hour congestion that would develop later in the afternoon. I found a spot near the center of the span where I could sit comfortably and keep an eye on the Ohio Tower. The creature was still there, silhouetted against the partly cloudy sky. From this distance and angle, I could see more details of its shape and posture. The head was disproportionately large compared to the body, and it seemed to be equipped with some kind of crest or ridge along the top of the skull. The wings were definitely folded, but I could make out individual flight feathers along the trailing edges. What bothered me most was the complete lack of movement. Real birds shift position constantly, adjusting their grip, turning their heads, stretching their wings. This thing had been frozen in place for more than 2 hours. Either it was dead, or it wasn't a bird at all. I decided to drive across to the Ohio side and take a closer look. The Ohio approach to the Silver Memorial Bridge includes a small parking area and boat ramp about 200 yards from the base of the tower. I parked there and walked to a position where I could look straight up at the top of the structure. With binoculars, I should have been able to see fine details of whatever was perched up there, but when I looked up, the tower was empty. I spent 10 minutes scanning the entire structure, checking every beam and cross brace where a large bird might have landed. Nothing. The sky was clear for miles in every direction, with no sign of anything flying away. Whatever had been perched on the tower had simply vanished. I walked back to my truck, wondering if the whole sighting had been some kind of optical illusion. Maybe I'd been looking at a piece of construction equipment or a maintenance device that had been removed while I was driving to the Ohio side. Perfectly reasonable explanation. That's when I heard the sound. It started as a low-frequency hum, like the vibration you feel when standing near high-voltage power lines. But this was deeper and more rhythmic, almost musical in quality. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, not from any particular direction, but from the air itself. It made my teeth ache and caused a strange pressure sensation in my inner ears. The humming continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I realized that all the normal ambient sounds had disappeared as well. No traffic noise from the bridge, no bird calls, no wind through the trees, just complete, unnatural quiet. Then I saw it standing in the middle of Route 7, about 50 yards away. The figure was bipedal, but definitely not human. Too tall, too broad across the shoulders, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. The skin, or hide, appeared to be dark gray or black, with a texture that looked almost metallic in the afternoon sunlight. But the most disturbing feature was the eyes. They glowed with a deep red light that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight. Not the bright red of LED bulbs or emergency flares, but more like the dull glow of heated metal. And they were focused directly on me. The creature didn't move as I stared at it. No breathing motion, no shifting of weight, no blinking. It might as well have been a mannequin, except for those glowing eyes that tracked my movements with predatory precision. I fumbled for my camera, thinking that photographic evidence might help explain what I was seeing. But as soon as I raised the camera, the creature's wings unfurled. The wingspan was enormous, at least 12 feet from tip to tip, possibly more. The wings weren't feathered like a bird's, but more like a bat's, with visible membranes stretched between elongated finger bones. When fully extended, they blocked out a significant portion of the sky. The creature took one step toward me, and every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run. I sprinted back to my truck, fumbling with the keys and cursing my hands for shaking so badly. When I finally got the engine started and looked back toward Route 7, the road was empty. No creature, no wings, no glowing eyes. Just normal afternoon traffic and a few pedestrians walking along the sidewalk. I sat in the truck for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just experienced. The rational part of my brain was insisting that I'd had some kind of panic attack or stress-induced hallucination. Bridge inspectors work alone in potentially dangerous conditions, and it's not uncommon for isolation and height exposure to cause psychological reactions. But I knew what I'd seen. And more importantly, I knew what I'd felt. The presence of that thing had been overwhelming, like standing too close to a high-voltage transformer or a powerful radio transmitter. My whole nervous system had been screaming warnings that I was in the presence of something dangerous. I drove back across the bridge to the West Virginia side and called my supervisor from the parking lot next to the Mothman statue. I told him I'd completed about 60% of the scheduled inspection, but that weather conditions were deteriorating and I needed to postpone the rest until the following week. Weather conditions? He asked. The forecast shows clear skies all day. Local conditions, I said. Wind gusts picking up near the bridge structure. Safety protocols require suspension of work when wind speeds exceed 20 miles per hour. It wasn't technically a lie. There had been wind. The displacement caused by those enormous wings unfurling, but I couldn't very well explain that to my supervisor. I drove home to Charleston that afternoon, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. That night, I did some research on the original Mothman sightings from the 1960s. Most of the accounts were remarkably consistent. A large winged humanoid with glowing red eyes, typically observed near the Silver Bridge or in the surrounding woods. Witnesses described the same sense of overwhelming dread that I'd experienced, and many reported that the creature seemed to be watching or waiting for something specific to happen. The sightings had peaked in the weeks immediately before the Silver Bridge collapse. According to newspaper archives, at least 12 different people had reported encounters with the creature during November and early December of 1967. Then, after the bridge fell and 46 people died, the sighting stopped completely. I returned to Point Pleasant the following Tuesday to complete the bridge inspection. This time, I brought a partner, another engineer named Tom Bradley who had 20 years of experience with bridge structural analysis. I didn't tell him about my previous encounter, just said I wanted a second opinion on some of the cable tension measurements. The work went normally. We climbed up into both tower structures, documented all the required data points, and found the bridge to be in excellent structural condition. Tom didn't report seeing anything unusual, and I didn't observe any large birds or mysterious creatures during the 6 hours we spent on the bridge. But as we were packing up our equipment that afternoon, Tom made a comment that stopped me cold. "You know," he said, "there's something weird about this bridge. I've been doing structural inspections for 2 decades, and I've never worked on a bridge that felt, I don't know how to describe it, like it's being watched. Watched by who? Not who. What?" Tom looked up at the towers rising above us. "It's probably just the history of this place getting to me. Knowing that 46 people died when the original bridge collapsed. But I kept feeling like there was something up there, just out of sight, paying attention to everything we were doing." I filed my inspection report the next day, recommending continued routine maintenance but no major repairs or modifications. The Silver Memorial Bridge was structurally sound and operating within all safety parameters. From an engineering perspective, there was nothing to worry about, but I also filed a separate report with the Point Pleasant Police Department, describing my encounter with the unknown creature on Route 7. The desk sergeant who took my statement was a guy named Officer Martinez, probably in his late 40s with the kind of weathered face that comes from 20 years of small-town police work. "Mr. Kellerman," he said after I finished describing what I'd seen, "you're not the first person to file this type of report. We get maybe 3 or 4 similar sightings each year, usually from people who don't know about the local history." "Similar how?" Martinez pulled out a filing cabinet and retrieved a folder marked Anomalous Wildlife Reports. It was thick enough to contain dozens of documents. "Large winged creature, red glowing eyes, sighted near the bridge or along Route 7. Sometimes people report it perched on power lines or cell towers. Always the same basic description." He opened the folder and showed me several incident reports dating back to the early 2000s. The details were remarkably consistent. Wingspan estimated between 10 and 15 feet, dark gray or black coloration, bipedal posture when standing, and eyes that glowed with their own internal light. Most of the witnesses were described as credible. Business people, teachers, off-duty emergency personnel. "What do you think it is?" I asked. "Honestly, I think Point Pleasant has become a magnet for people who want to see something mysterious. Tourist expectations combined with low-light conditions and unusual architecture can create some convincing illusions." Martinez closed the folder and looked at me directly. "But I will say this. The sightings tend to cluster around times when something bad is about to happen." "Bad how?" "Industrial accidents, severe weather events, traffic fatalities. Nothing as dramatic as the original bridge collapse, but enough of a pattern to make you wonder." He handed me a business card. "If you see it again, call me directly. And if you start having dreams or anxiety about driving across bridges, talk to someone about it. Post-traumatic stress can develop from a lot less than what you experienced." I left Point Pleasant that afternoon with more questions than answers, but at least I had confirmation that other people had seen similar things. Maybe it was mass hysteria or tourist psychology, but the consistency of the report suggested something more substantial than random hallucinations. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the West Virginia Department of Transportation, informing me that the Silver Memorial Bridge would be temporarily closed for emergency repairs. A routine inspection by another engineering team had discovered stress fractures in several of the main support cables. Fractures that hadn't been visible during my inspection just a few weeks earlier. The bridge was closed to all traffic for 6 days while crews replaced the damaged cables and reinforced the anchor points. If the fractures had gone undetected for another month or 2, they could have led to a catastrophic failure during peak traffic conditions. I called Officer Martinez to let him know about the bridge closure and the connection to my sighting. "Mr. Kellerman," he said, "I've been a cop in this town for 18 years. I've learned not to dismiss coincidences, especially when they involve that particular bridge. Whatever you saw out there, whether it was a real creature or some kind of psychological phenomenon, it showed up right before a potentially dangerous structural problem was discovered. You think it was trying to warn me? I think there are things in this world that don't fit into normal categories. And sometimes, those things try to communicate with us in the only way they can." I never saw the creature again, but I did make one more interesting discovery. While researching the original Silver Bridge collapse, I found references to several bridge inspectors who had reported unusual sightings in the weeks before the disaster. Their reports had been dismissed at the time as stress-related hallucinations, and most of the documentation had been lost or destroyed. But one report survived in the archives of the Mason County Historical Society. It was filed by an inspector named Robert Hayes on November 20th, 1967, just 2.5 weeks before the bridge fell. Hayes described encountering a large winged creature with glowing red eyes while conducting routine maintenance on the original Silver Bridge. According to his report, the creature had been perched on the main suspension tower, watching him work. When Hayes tried to approach for a closer look, the creature had spread its wings and taken flight, but not before fixing him with a stare that conveyed imminent danger. Hayes had recommended immediate structural analysis of the bridge supports and cables, suggesting that his encounter might be connected to undetected structural problems. His recommendations were reviewed by the State Highway Department and filed away without action. 3 weeks later, the Silver Bridge collapsed during rush hour traffic. I keep Hayes' report in my desk drawer now, along with my own detailed account of what I saw on the Silver Memorial Bridge. Call it insurance, call it documentation, call it whatever you want. But if that thing ever shows up again, I want there to be a paper trail for the next person who has to make sense of it. The bridge engineering community is small enough that stories get passed around between colleagues over coffee and at professional conferences. I've heard similar accounts from inspectors working in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky. Always the same basic elements. A winged humanoid with glowing eyes, observed near bridges or other infrastructure during the weeks before serious structural problems are discovered. Most of my colleagues dismiss these stories as folklore or stress-induced hallucinations. Bridge inspection can be dangerous work, and it's not uncommon for people to develop anxiety or phobias about heights and structural failure. The mind can create elaborate defensive mechanisms to cope with occupational stress, but the timing is too consistent to ignore. And the physical descriptions are too similar across different states and different decades. I still do bridge inspections throughout West Virginia, but I pay closer attention to environmental factors now. If I see large birds or unusual wildlife near a structure I'm inspecting, I document it in my report. And if I ever encounter anything that makes me feel the same overwhelming sense of dread I experienced in Point Pleasant, I'm going to recommend immediate emergency structural analysis, because whatever that thing was, whether it's a real creature, a psychological phenomenon, or something else entirely, it seems to show up when infrastructure is about to fail, and in my line of work, that's not a warning you can afford to ignore. If you work in construction, engineering, or any field that involves critical infrastructure, pay attention to unusual wildlife sightings near your job sites. Document everything, even if it seems ridiculous. And if you ever see something with glowing red eyes watching you work, don't dismiss it as imagination. Take it as a sign that you need to look more carefully at whatever you're responsible for maintaining. Sometimes the strangest warnings are the most important ones to heed. If this story reminds you of your own encounters with things that shouldn't exist, share them in the comments. Whether it's mysterious creatures, unexplained phenomena, or just gut feelings that saved you from disaster, these experiences deserve to be documented and discussed. Hit the like button if you think there's more to reality than what we can easily explain, and subscribe for more accounts from people whose jobs put them face to face with the unknown. Stay alert out there. You never know what might be watching. The red eyes reflected in my night vision scope weren't supposed to be 12 feet off the ground. My name is Tyler Brooks, and I work as a security contractor for the Department of Energy, specializing in perimeter monitoring at sensitive facilities throughout the Ohio River Valley. It's not glamorous work, mostly sitting in patrol vehicles or guard towers, watching fence lines and access roads for 8 to 12 hours at a time, but it pays well. The benefits are solid, and you get to carry some interesting equipment. In late September of 2020, I was assigned to a 3-month contract at the former site of the West Virginia Ordnance Works, about 7 miles north of Point Pleasant. During World War II, the facility had manufactured TNT and other explosives for the military. After the war ended, most of the buildings were demolished and the land was converted into the McClintock Wildlife Management Area. 2,000 acres of forest, wetlands, and abandoned concrete structures managed by the State Division of Natural Resources. The security contract was straightforward. The Department of Energy was conducting soil remediation work to clean up residual contamination from the original munitions manufacturing, and they needed someone to monitor the work sites overnight to prevent vandalism or unauthorized access. The area had a reputation for attracting urban explorers, paranormal investigators, and local teenagers looking for a place to party, so a visible security presence was essential. My shift ran from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., 7 days a week. The patrol route covered about 15 miles of gravel roads and hiking trails, connecting 8 different remediation sites scattered throughout the wildlife area. Each site consisted of temporary fencing around areas where soil samples were being collected and analyzed. Nothing too exciting, just making sure nobody had cut through the chain link or left trash around the equipment. I was provided with a Ford F-250 pickup truck equipped with a light bar, CB radio, and emergency medical kit. My personal gear included standard security equipment, flashlights, binoculars, digital camera, and a night vision monocular for checking fence lines in low-light conditions. The night vision device was military surplus, a third-generation image intensifier that could resolve clear images at distances up to 500 yards. The first 2 weeks of the assignment went smoothly. The McClintock area is popular with hunters and bird watchers during the day, but it's essentially deserted after sunset. I'd make my rounds every 2 hours, checking each remediation site and documenting any changes in site conditions or security status. Most nights, the only wildlife I encountered were deer, raccoons, and the occasional black bear foraging near the wetlands. The terrain was a mix of dense second-growth forest, open meadows, and concrete ruins from the original ordnance works. Some of the bunkers and manufacturing buildings had been too heavily reinforced to demolish economically, so they'd been sealed with concrete and left to slowly disappear under decades of vegetation growth. Walking through the area at night felt like exploring the ruins of some lost civilization. On October 7th, I started noticing unusual bird activity around the power transmission lines that run through the northern section of the wildlife area. The lines carry electricity from the John Amos Power Plant in Putnam County to distribution substations in Ohio, supported by steel towers that march across the landscape in perfectly straight rows. During the day, you might see hawks or eagles using the towers as hunting perches, but at night the lines are usually deserted. But for 3 consecutive nights, I observed large birds roosting on the transmission towers between midnight and 3 a.m., not just 1 or 2 birds, sometimes as many as 6 or 8, distributed across several different towers. They appeared to be much larger than any species I was familiar with, and they exhibited unusual behavior patterns. Normal birds shift position constantly, preening their feathers, adjusting their grip, or turning to scan for threats. These birds remained completely motionless for hours at a time, like statues mounted on the tower crossbeams, and when they did move, it was all at once. The entire group would take flight simultaneously, without any visible or audible signal. I tried photographing them with the digital camera, but the images were too dark and distant to show useful detail. The night vision scope provided better resolution, but something about the bird's appearance didn't look right through the green-tinted display. The proportions seemed off. Wings too broad, heads too large, posture too upright for natural bird anatomy. On October 10th, I decided to investigate more closely. Around 2 a.m., I parked the patrol truck about 200 yards from the nearest transmission tower and approached on foot, using the night vision scope to monitor the birds without alerting them to my presence. There were 4 of them positioned on different levels of the tower structure, 1 at the very top, 2 on intermediate crossbeams, and 1 about 30 feet above the ground. Through the night vision scope, I could see details that had been invisible from a distance. These weren't birds at all. The creatures had roughly humanoid torsos with elongated arms that ended in what looked like hands rather than wingtips. Their heads were disproportionately large, with pronounced brow ridges and what appeared to be external ear structures. but the most disturbing feature was their eyes. Even through the green-tinted image intensifier, their eyes glowed with a deep red light that had nothing to do with reflected infrared illumination. The glow was steady and intense, like the heating elements in an electric stove, and all 4 pairs of eyes were focused directly on my position. I lowered the night vision scope and looked at the transmission tower with naked eyes. In the darkness, I could see 4 sets of red dots arranged vertically on the tower structure. Too bright to be reflections, too steady to be electronic devices. The creatures were definitely watching me, but they made no move to flee or approach. I raised the scope again and studied them more carefully. The one at the top of the tower had spread its wings slightly, revealing a membrane structure similar to a bat's wing but much larger. The wingspan had to be at least 10 feet, possibly 12. The creature's posture was perfectly balanced despite the wind that was causing the tower to sway gently back and forth. I spent about 15 minutes observing them, documenting their positions and behavior patterns. They never moved, never shifted weight, never adjusted their grip on the steel beams, but their eyes tracked my every movement with predatory precision. Finally, I decided to test their reaction to direct illumination. I pulled out my high-powered LED flashlight and aimed it at the creature perched lowest on the tower. The moment the light beam touched it, all 4 creatures took flight simultaneously. Their wings were enormous, easily 12 to 15 feet from tip to tip, with flight membranes that caught the moonlight as they climbed rapidly into the sky. But what struck me most was the complete silence of their flight. No wing beats, no air displacement, no sound at all. They simply rose straight up like helicopters, gained about 200 feet of altitude, and disappeared into the darkness heading south toward Point Pleasant. I stood there for several minutes, scanning the sky with the night vision scope and listening for any sound that might indicate where they'd gone. But the night had returned to normal. Just the ambient noise of wind through the trees and the distant hum of electricity flowing through the transmission lines. I documented the encounter in my security log, describing the creatures as large, unidentified birds exhibiting unusual behavior patterns. Not technically a lie, but I couldn't bring myself to write down what I'd actually observed. 4 humanoid creatures with 12-foot wingspans and glowing red eyes would have triggered an immediate psychiatric evaluation and termination of my security clearance. The next morning, I called my supervisor and reported the bird activity around the transmission lines, suggesting that the Department of Energy might want to coordinate with the power company to ensure the creatures weren't interfering with electrical systems. He thanked me for the heads up and said he'd pass the information along to the appropriate agencies, but I also did some research on my own. I'd heard stories about the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant during the 1960s, but I'd always assumed they were tourist folklore designed to bring visitors to the area. Now I was wondering if there might be more substance to the reports than I'd previously believed. The original sightings had occurred in the same general area where I was working. The McClintock Wildlife Management Area had been part of the TNT manufacturing complex during World War II, and many of the Mothman encounters had been reported near the abandoned bunkers and concrete structures. The descriptions matched what I'd observed. Large winged humanoids with glowing red eyes, typically seen at night near industrial or infrastructure sites. I found references to dozens of sightings between November 1966 and December 1967, all within a 10-mile radius of Point Pleasant. Witnesses included police officers, construction workers, and local residents, people with no obvious motive to fabricate elaborate hoaxes. The sightings had stopped abruptly after the Silver Bridge collapse, leading some researchers to speculate that the creatures were somehow connected to the disaster. But if that were true, why were they showing up again now, more than 50 years later? I continued my security patrols for the next 2 weeks, but I didn't encounter the creatures again. The transmission towers remained empty at night, and I began to think the whole episode had been some kind of anomalous wildlife migration. Maybe a species of large bat or owl that was passing through the area on its way to winter roosting grounds. Then, On October 24th, I received a call from my supervisor that changed everything. "Tyler," he said, "we need to evacuate the McClintock site immediately. There's been a structural failure at one of the remediation areas, and we're concerned about potential chemical exposure." "What kind of structural failure?" "One of the sealed bunkers has developed a crack in the concrete cap. Ground-penetrating radar shows that the interior might contain drums of chemical waste that were never properly documented. EPA is sending a hazmat team, but we need to clear all personnel from the area until they can assess the contamination risk." I loaded up my equipment and drove to the affected remediation site to retrieve some monitoring equipment that had been left overnight. The bunker in question was located in a heavily wooded area about half a mile from the nearest access road. A low concrete dome covered with 50 years of vegetation growth that made it almost invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. The crack in the concrete cap was clearly visible, a jagged line about 3 feet long that split the dome from north to south. The crack was wide enough that I could see darkness inside the bunker, and there was a distinct chemical odor emanating from the opening. Not pleasant, a mixture of solvents, rust, and organic decay that made my eyes water. I documented the damage with photographs and GPS coordinates, then began packing up the monitoring equipment. That's when I noticed the footprints. The area around the bunker was covered with fallen leaves and soft soil that had been disturbed recently. Mixed in with normal deer and raccoon tracks, I found a series of impressions that didn't match any animal I was familiar with. They were roughly humanoid in shape, elongated with what looked like claw marks at the front, but much larger than human footprints, about 14 inches long and 6 inches wide, with a stride length that suggested something with very long legs. The footprints formed a rough circle around the damaged bunker, as if something had been pacing around the perimeter. Some of the impressions were deep enough to suggest a creature weighing several hundred pounds, much heavier than any bird species. I was photographing the footprints when I heard the sound. It started as a low-frequency hum, like the vibration from high-voltage power lines, but deeper and more musical. The sound seemed to come from underground, not from any particular direction, but from the earth itself. It made my teeth ache and caused a strange pressure sensation in my inner ears. The humming continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I realized that all the normal forest sounds had disappeared as well. No bird calls, no insect noise, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just complete, unnatural quiet. That's when I saw them emerging from the tree line. 3 of the creatures I'd observed on the transmission towers, moving through the forest with a fluid, predatory gait that was definitely not human. They were bipedal, but their movement patterns were wrong. Too smooth, too coordinated, like they were floating just above the ground rather than walking on it. As they approached the bunker, I could see more details of their anatomy. The skin appeared to be dark gray or black, with a texture that looked almost metallic in the filtered sunlight. Their heads were large and angular, with prominent brow ridges that cast deep shadows over those glowing red eyes. The wings were folded against their backs, but I could see the membrane edges extending down to their ankles. The creatures ignored me completely, focusing their attention on the damaged bunker. The largest one, probably 8 feet tall with a wingspan that would have exceeded 15 feet, approached the crack in the concrete and peered inside. The other 2 positioned themselves on either side of the opening, like sentries. I stayed perfectly still, hoping they hadn't noticed me. But after about a minute, all 3 heads turned in my direction simultaneously. The eye contact was overwhelming. Not just the visual impact of those glowing red orbs, but a psychological pressure that made it difficult to think clearly. I felt like I was being scanned or analyzed by some kind of alien intelligence that was evaluating whether I represented a threat. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the creatures took flight. Their wings unfurled in perfect synchronization, creating enormous shadows that blocked out the sun day. The takeoff was completely silent, with no wing beats or air displacement that I could detect. They rose straight up like helicopters, gained altitude rapidly, and disappeared over the tree canopy heading north toward the Ohio River. I stood there for several more minutes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Then I packed up the remaining equipment as quickly as possible and got the hell out of there. The EPA hazmat team arrived that afternoon and cordoned off the damaged bunker. Their preliminary assessment confirmed the presence of chemical waste drums inside the sealed structure, along with evidence of groundwater contamination that could have spread throughout the surrounding area if left undetected. The bunker had been sealed in 1945, and there were no records indicating what specific materials had been stored inside. The concrete cap was designed to last for decades, but exposure to chemical vapors and groundwater infiltration had gradually weakened the structure until it finally cracked open. According to the EPA report, if the containment failure had gone undetected for another few months, toxic chemicals could have leached into the local water supply and threatened the health of thousands of people in the Point Pleasant area. The crack in the bunker had been discovered during a routine site survey just 2 days after I'd encountered the creatures examining the same structure. I filed my final security report and completed my contract with the Department of Energy, but I never mentioned the creatures or their apparent interest in the damaged bunker. That information went into a separate document that I keep locked in my gun safe at home, along with photographs of the footprints and GPS coordinates of the encounter site, because I think those things, whatever they are, were trying to warn us about the contamination problem. They'd been monitoring the area for weeks, watching the remediation work and keeping track of potential environmental hazards. When the bunker finally cracked open, they were there to investigate and document the extent of the damage. Maybe there's some kind of undiscovered species that's adapted to life around industrial sites and infrastructure. Maybe they're interdimensional beings that manifest during times of environmental crisis. Or maybe there's something else entirely that we don't have words to describe. But one thing I'm certain of, they showed up at exactly the right time to help identify a serious threat to public health. Whether that was intentional or just coincidence, I can't say, but I'm grateful they were watching. If you work in environmental remediation, industrial security, or any field that deals with potentially hazardous materials, pay attention to unusual wildlife activity around your job sites. Document everything, even if it seems impossible or ridiculous. And if you ever encounter something with glowing red eyes investigating the same areas you're responsible for monitoring, consider the possibility that it might be trying to help. Sometimes the most unlikely allies are the most valuable ones. Share your own encounters with unexplained phenomena in the comments below, especially if they involved environmental or industrial hazards that were discovered shortly afterward. These patterns might be more common than we realize, and documenting them could help save lives. Hit the like button if you think there's more to the natural world than what we can easily categorize, and subscribe for more accounts from people whose jobs put them in contact with the unknown. Stay vigilant out there. You never know what might be keeping watch alongside you.